Good evening and welcome back to Web Yeshiva Live from Beit Agnon in Jerusalem for a special conversation about Jerusalem in advance of Yom Yerushalayim, the 50th Yom Yerushalayim, the 50th anniversary of the miraculous Six-Day War and the reunification of Jerusalem and our return to the old city of Jerusalem. As we've mentioned many times, we just a few months ago celebrated the 50th anniversary of Agnon's Nobel. In the period between December 66 and June 67, it was a period of increasing tension. Agnon found himself in America, in New York, at the outbreak of the war, and he cut his visit short and hurried back in order to be here with his family and to be present at the victory of the Milchemet Sheshet Yamim. But long before that, Jerusalem had occupied a very special place in his mind and in his writing. Like most topics that Agnon wrote about, it was not without ambivalence. The other great modern writer for whom Jerusalem is a centerpiece is, of course, the poet Yehuda Amichai. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about Amichai tonight, and we're going to make some comparisons, or we're going to look at parallel themes in Agnon and Amichai. But it should be made clear that my expertise in Amichai should not even be considered expertise, and I don't purport to have the kind of knowledge of Amichai that I think I've shown I have of Agnon. But nevertheless, reading helps, and we can all make an effort. And I've long admired him as a poet, and I've long read his poetry, and we'll make a go of it. Amichai, Agnon, we already know. Amichai was born in. Before we get to that, sorry, unfortunately I have to share the sad news that we heard today of the passing of our friend Professor Alan Mintz of JTS. Alan and I, rather sudden and untimely death. Alan and I had edited last year Agnon's Ir Umloa in English, a city in its fullness, a collection of Agnon's tales of Buchach. And in the coming days, in the coming weeks, Stanford University Press is releasing Alan's companion volume entitled Ancestral Tales, Reading the Buchach Stories of S.Y. Agnon, which is an analysis of the stories that are in a city in its fullness. And it's a great personal loss for me, and it's a loss for people that are concerned with Agnon scholarship, and it's a true tragedy for his friends and family. Amichai is born in 1924 in Würzburg, Germany. He died in 2000. Amichai is recognized as the greatest modern Hebrew poet. And he's also recognized as among the world's greatest poets worldwide, certainly since the mid-late 1960s. His recognition, his worldwide recognition, is partially due to his success in translation. He's been translated into over 40 languages. The most important one, of course, is English in terms of gaining a kind of worldwide recognition. And it's also a function of his being among the first Israeli Hebrew poets to write in modern colloquial Hebrew. You remember there's a long tradition of Hebrew poetry going back to the Bible, going back to the Tehillim, through the Middle Ages of the great Paitanim, Yehuda Halevi, Shlomo ibn Gabirol, and etc. And Hebrew poetry, even early modern Hebrew poetry, even Hebrew poetry of the beginning and mid-20th century, was marked by a kind of biblical ornateness, a kind of well, yeah, that's the word for it, I guess, an ornateness in Hebrew. If you've read the poetry of Chaim Nachman Bialik, who was, of course, the national poet in the earlier part of the century, his poetry is sometimes hard to get through. Amichai's poetry, much of it reads almost like modern prose. And many of his poems, in fact, are prose poems, and therefore they're easier to understand, they're easier to digest, and they suffer translation more readily without doing damage to the poem. Amichai was born again in 1924 in Germany, in a city called Würzburg, into an Orthodox family. They come on Aliyah in 1935. They very quickly settle in Yerushalayim. He attends religious school. Later in life, in early adulthood, he moves away from orthodoxy, from traditional observance. He joins the Palmach. He fights in the War of Independence. Actually, in all of Israel's great wars, the War of Independence, the Six-Day War, even the Yom Kippur War in 1973, when he's quite a bit older. And of course, as a subject of his poetry, war and Israel's wars and the effects and the results certainly serve as a subject for what he's writing about. And his poetry deals really with the day-to-day, with everyday life of here in Israel, life, love, relationships, but it's as much philosophical as anything else. If anything, he's a philosophical poet. His poetry is marked by a kind of gentle irony. It's marked by the theme of the struggle with religious faith. In these two regards, the irony and the struggle with religious faith, you can see the connections to, if not the influence of, the connections to Agnon. It's very Agnonian, but they come to it from very different places. Of course, they were men of very different generations. Amichai was born in 1924. Agnon had been already born in 1887. He's already a full 2 generations almost, or a generation and a half older. When they're writing about Yerushalayim, in almost every case, they're writing about Yerushalayim of different experiences. Amichai only really gets going as a poet although he starts writing in the 50s, he only really gets going as a poet in the mid-60s and later. So when Agnon is writing about Yerushalayim, he's writing about Yerushalayim before 67. He's either writing about the Yerushalayim that he remembers from before the establishment of the state, when Jerusalem is kind of the center of the Yishuv Hayashan, the old Jerusalem. If you remember our reading of Tehillah, and if not, Tehillah is a very important story for the conversation about Agnon and Yerushalayim. You should review the story Tehillah. You can email me, and I'm happy to send you a copy, or you can, better yet, go online to the archives of webyeshiva.org and listen to I think there are 3 sessions on Tehillah. Welcome. Agnon is there describing, I'll come back to Tehillah in a moment, but Agnon there is describing, people are coming in late. I just have to explain to people online. People are coming in late, and you know whose fault it is? It's Trump. Yeah. Oh, because of that. No, because they were having practice for the arrival. All of Rehov King David was closed because they were having practice for the arrival. Yes. Yeah. Anyway, so on a helicopter. Yeah. Anyway, so let's get back here. But in other words, for Agnon, the Yerushalayim that he's describing is very often the Yerushalayim that he knew from the 19-teens and 1920s, and then after the War of Independence, when Jerusalem is closed off to us, he's remembering it, almost memorializing it. And very often, although there are earlier poems, for Yehuda Amichai, he's already describing a reunited Jerusalem. He's already standing on this line of that divide that we're now marking the 50th anniversary of. But in terms of their struggle with religious faith, they're also coming to it from different directions. Agnon, as I've described multiple times, also grows up in a completely traditional environment, leaves traditional observance, and returns to it. Amichai does not make that return movement, but yet he is very theologically engaged in his poetry throughout his career. God appears as a character in stories, and sometimes he was criticized by the pious for being irreverent, but it's a deeply, profoundly religious reckoning with Jewish tradition and Jewish faith and Jewish belief and Jewish rituals. You may remember, those of you that have been with us in the past, a poem that I've taught in the past. He has a lovely, evocative poem about the nostalgia for his youth. And here's another essential, for his religious youth. But it's not a completely rose-colored nostalgia. It's a kind of ambivalent nostalgia. And here you really do see the difference that Agnon was a Galicianer and Amichai was a Yeke. He was a German Jew. In Germany, certainly in the 1920s and early 30s, when he was born and raised, even into an Orthodox family, even a child who was given a religious education, nevertheless, German Jewry had its own flavor. And among the elements of the life of German Jewry is more of an emphasis on synagogue life over yeshiva study. And therefore, many of his memories and associations, as opposed to Agnon, who's always reminiscent of the Beit Midrash, for Amichai, it's the Beit Knesset. And the rituals of Jewish life are the rituals of the synagogue. So he has a very evocative poem where he, as an older man, describes putting on a talit, and that kind of swooping motion of putting the talit over his head and wrapping himself in the talit, which he describes metaphorically so beautifully, like a caterpillar going into a cocoon and then opening its wings like a butterfly. These are all these evocative, nostalgic memories of synagogue life. That poem doesn't touch on our topic of Jerusalem today, so I'm not going to go into it. But if you're interested, I'm happy to send it to you. As I said, he had a religious upbringing, which he abandoned traditional observance, but he maintained this ongoing engagement with religious themes in many, also erotic themes. Also, he wasn't a religious man, but he was engaged. He wasn't religious in a conventional sense of observance, but he was very deeply engaged with these topics of Jewish life and thought and faith and ritual, and he's wrestling with it in his poetry. Yes, of course, for both. Agnon's poetry, by the way, there are two books that I would bring your attention to. Agnon. I'm going to keep doing this. I'm going to keep saying Agnon. I mean Amichai, and Amichai, I mean Agnon. But I did it again. Amichai's poetry is collected in this 5-volume set from Shokin. In other words, in his life, he published many volumes of poetry, some of them slim. He also, by the way, wrote, when he was younger, wrote some prose. He wrote, I think, 2 novels, if I'm not mistaken. But just like Agnon, when he was young, wrote poetry and then left it behind when he understood that he was going to have success as a prose writer, it seems that Amichai had the opposite experience. So Amichai's poetry has all been collected in this 5-volume set available from Shokin in Hebrew, and in English. So in English, there are a number of volumes translated, but most recently, this volume, edited by Robert Alter, The Poetry of Yehuda Amichai, was published last year by Farrar Straus in New York, and it's not a complete translation of all of his poetry, but it's the best 1-volume edition of Amichai's poetry in English. But of course, the one topic that overlaps most in their writing is that of Jerusalem. Jerusalem is an ongoing source of inspiration and fascination, and even critique for both Agnon and Amichai, and therefore we'll spend a little time talking about it. And the truth is, all we could do tonight is if all I did were read to you the best hits, the most beautiful passages from Agnon's prose and Amichai's poetry about Jerusalem, Dayenu, it would be a sufficient justification to gather together on a chilly night in the garden to prepare our thoughts for Yom Yerushalayim. But we should say that Yom Yerushalayim is really a remarkable thing. Now, it's true that over the past 50 years, it's become complicated, and national feelings are ambivalent. But we must remember that in 1967, it was widely understood, left, right, and center, as being nothing less than miraculous. And regardless of one's attitude to the final resolution, which maybe will be banged out this week through the visit of the president. But regardless of one's attitude to what the final resolution is, it's important to remember for these people 50 years ago, and some people remember 50 years ago, this was nothing less than miraculous. Both the miraculous salvation that we were on the brink, and not only did we survive, but we were able to successfully put down our enemies while we were on the defense. But the return to the old city, the reunification of the city, was and nothing captures that more than the very real messianic fervor that's captured in this image of Rav Goren and the soldiers and the tzanchanim, the paratroopers at the wall, and the feeling that pervaded the time then. Amichai's poetry, as I said, its greatness is its ability to capture the Yom Yom. And this is just a picture of a sign, on Emek Refaim here in Jerusalem. They have this project where they put poetry up on these street lamp signs. And this is just a poem. It's the beauty of Jerusalem. I assume other cities also revere their artists and poets in such a way. I'm not familiar. But here in Jerusalem, to walk down Rehov Emek Refaim and to see these poems by Yehuda Amichai hanging off the street lamps, this is a lovely, but not connected to Jerusalem per se, but it's not only Yehuda Amichai, it's all types of, but Amichai is always probably overrepresented, right? If you recount which poets are on the street lamps, Amichai gets more than his fair share. I'm sure the other poets would say. Here's just a short stitch of a poem about shattered love. How kol zman hayinu yachtav hayinu kemisperayim tovim umoilim. The whole time we were together, meaning as a couple, as a romantic couple, we were like a good pair of scissors. Because scissors, you have these two things working in tandem. Achar sheniparadnu chazarnu liot shtei sakinim chadot. But when we separated, then we're just two sharp knives, right? It's just such a beautiful description of the everyday life of romance gone awry. There's a poem Amichai has. All of the translations that I'm showing of Amichai's poems, we'll look at many in English, and some I'll bring the Hebrew so you can hear the flavor of it. But all these poems are from the Altar volume. The ecology of Jerusalem. And here, now we're getting into the description of Jerusalem, but you see how it's a very kind of pedestrian description. It's a very common, everyday description. This is not Naomi Shemer, right? This is not the beauty and the splendor and the description of Yerushalayim Shel Zahav, which is so inspiring and so lovely, and the music is wonderful, and it draws on our emotions, and it, right? That's a very different type of poetry. That's not what you're getting from Amichai. Right? Right? Amichai, you get a line like this. The air over Jerusalem is saturated with prayers and dreams, like the air over industrial cities. It's hard to breathe. Right? Like we imagine, like right now there are radio waves passing over. Right? The radio is broadcasting right now. And if we had a radio, we could open it up. We could turn it on and we would receive those radio waves and be able to hear what they're saying, right? The same way like there's Wi-Fi here right now. You can check your email, but please don't do it in the middle of the class. That's rude, right? But the same way that your emails are flying around here in the ether, so too are the prayers and dreams of the Jewish people. But it's kind of like when you look at an industrial zone and you see like the smog hovering over that part of the city. Sometimes it's a little hard to breathe, meaning life in Jerusalem is so thick, right? You're saturated by faith and fervor and religion and prayer and dreams and hopes and aspirations that sometimes my wife and I were in Haifa for Shabbat. There was here from Beit Agnon, they do these weekends, very nice. We were in Haifa, we never get to Haifa. I mean, it's like the other end of the world for us. I've said, and Friday afternoon, we're walking around, we go to see the gardens. I love Yerushalayim, but it's so much more relaxed here. So I said, sure, you never heard of anyone having Haifa syndrome, right? But Jerusalem syndrome we know about. Right? A new shipment of history arrives, right? That's what Jerusalem is. He has another poem which describes Jerusalem. Here's the Hebrew, and I'll read it in Hebrew so you can hear it. I'll read part of it in Hebrew so you can hear it. Ra'iti bechatzer Yerushalmit, ra'iti garinim mefuzarim al bad parus, liyibush b'shemesh. I saw in a certain, I'm not going to try to translate it poetically, I'll just do a loose translation. I saw in a certain Jerusalem courtyard, I saw seeds, sunflower seeds, pumpkin seeds, watermelon seeds laid out on a sheet to dry. V'amarti, eyeh lahem lehistorion. I will be the historian of these sunflower seeds that are out drying. I'll tell them about the watermelons, about the pumpkins from which they were drawn. I'll tell them their history. We're all like little seeds, like we all came from someplace. I demand that the sand should remember the stones from which the sand was chiseled off of, broken off of, ground off of. And from each little rock, I demand that it should remember the big boulder from which it was chiseled or chipped. And I want the boulder to remember the volcano, the lava, the fire in which it was formed. But as for myself, I can't even remember. I've forgotten what I did last summer. Right? I want the sunflower seed. I want the pumpkin seed to know the pumpkin it came from, and I want the grain of sand to know which rock it came from. Right? Like Chad Gadya. The grain of sand comes from a rock. The rock comes from a stone. The stone comes from a boulder. The boulder came from the volcano. I want it to know its history. But me, I can't remember what I did last summer. or even what happened yesterday, Biyom Revi'i, Wednesday. Aval ani zocher et hashir shahayu shirim oto haleviim beveit hamikdash biyom revi'i. I can't remember what I did last Wednesday, but isn't it ironic that the Jewish memory is, because why? Because we all get to a certain point where it's hard to remember what we did yesterday. But I know the song that the Levites sang in the Holy Temple on Yom Revi'i, on Wednesday. Because why? How do we know the song that the Levites would sing on the first day, on Sunday and Monday? Because it's part of the Tefillah, right? Hayom Yom Revi'i l'Shabbat, Shabo Hayu Halavim Omrim Beveit HaMikdash, ... It's an irony of the Jewish memory, right? It's easy to remember the psalm that was sung 2,000 years ago on any given day, but sometimes the day-to-day, that escapes us. But that's the power of Jewish memory. And you walk down, you're trying to give an explanation for why that might be, right? Why it is that we can remember the telephone number of the house we grew up in, but not so much where we live now. But you understand the magic behind what he's saying. When Agnon won the Nobel in '66, Amichai was spending a year abroad in New York, or he spent time in Berkeley, he spent time in New York and other places, and he writes a little essay which was published in a magazine called Midstream. I've made reference to it before, but here I'm going to quote parts that I didn't make reference to earlier. In an earlier course, I had referenced the parts where he talks about the meaning that a Hebrew author has won the Nobel. We can all have some hot tea if you want. It's getting chilly. Hope it doesn't rain. But here he's talking about things more related to our topic tonight. If you're interested, I'm happy to send you a copy. You can email me. I'm happy to send you a copy of the whole essay. I was in Greenwich Village when I first heard that Agnon had been awarded the Nobel Prize. A group of us were comfortably sprawled in our chairs like film directors. Several priests of the LSD cult had been invited over to discuss the drug and the problems of the world in general. Our surroundings were pleasantly and appropriately artistic. The discussion was in full swing when someone came up to congratulate me on Agnon's receipt of the prize. I hadn't known about it. The conversation in the room kept returning to the subject of freedom. Right? This is the '60s, right? The liberation of psychedelic drugs. They're talking about freedom. Tremendous freedom was possible with the help of LSD. I thought of Yitzchak Kummer, the hero of Tzmol Shel Shom, of Only Yesterday, the Oleh of the second Aliyah who arrives and has a little trouble acclimating himself here to life in Eretz Yisrael and unfortunately meets a bad end. I thought of Yitzchak Kummer, the hero of one of Agnon's novels, who could never have become the hero of a book had he been able to free himself from his sense of guilt and ties to the past. Right? For Agnon, it's inconceivable for the Jew to disconnect. Right? What was the motto of the LSD generation? Tune in, drop out. What was the other one? Right? So Yitzchak Kummer had been able to drop acid and forget about everything. He couldn't have become the hero of his own story because he would have no longer been the carrying around all of Jewish history with him. If he'd been able to disconnect, if he'd been able to toss off the baggage of Jewish history, if he'd been able to forget, if he'd been a seed that had forgotten the watermelon from which he was drawn. Everywhere and at all times, Agnon lives and creates in two different worlds. He lives in the new city of Jerusalem and in the old. He lives in Galicia, where he was born, and in Germany, where he made his first acquaintance with Western culture. In relation to the Holy Land, however, he treats both of these places as a single antipode. Even after the State of Israel was created, Agnon remained loyal to the Palestine of the 1910s and 20s and 30s, the era of the second Aliyah, and the era of the time of the third Aliyah, the period where he comes back from his sojourn in Germany. There are very few stories, almost none of Agnon's writing is set after the establishment of the state. There are some examples, but besides the fact that a very large percentage was written before, but everything that Agnon writes after 1948, remember, he was active largely up to the end. but he's writing stories of the second Aliyah or of Buchach. In relation to the Holy Land, however, he treats both of these places single-handedly. Even after the state of Israel was created, Agnon remained loyal to the Palestine of the teens, 20s, and 30s. He lives in a religious world and in a secular world at the same time. The leaders of Israel's religious parties have tried more than once to employ him in their service, but this tells us more about the limited mentality of the politicians than it does about Agnon and his work. An ironic individual in the highest sense is above being yoked to the petty interests of party politics. An Agnon without his irony would not be Agnon. So his attitude towards Jerusalem, towards Israel, is not to the Israel that you and I live in. And it's not even necessarily the Israel that he lived in the 40s and 50s and 60s. It's to a kind of earlier or idealized Israel. Here's a picture of Agnon at the Kotel after 67. Again, he's already, at this point, he's quite an old man. He's already nearing 80, if not 80. Not that 80 is old, you understand. But in 67, 80 was old. 80 is the new 40, or something like that. 40 is the new 80, but 80 is the new, right? After 67, Agnon, really in one of the only examples of him taking a political stand, did sign on to the declarations of the Eretz Yisrael Hashlema, the campaign to kind of that we would annex all of the territories that had been won in the Six-Day War. At that point already, he was quite an old man, and there were a lot of people right after the war who caught up in the excitement of the times, did that, and then came to change his mind. We don't know what he would have done because his active time, the arena, was limited at that point. But it was in fact the only time that he really took a public political stand on anything. Yep. So, in other words, why Agnon? Look, authors are like that. They, first of all, much by the time 1948, is why his stories are set all before the establishment of the state. So that's just before the establishment of the state. They're set in largely, much of them are set in the 19th century. Now again, in 1948, he's already 60 years old. He still has another 20 active years left, but he had found his creative home writing about the land of Israel at the time of the second Aliyah, and a little bit after, writing about Buchach, his hometown in the 19th century and earlier, meaning he imagines a world before he's even born, and a little bit, lesser so, Germany of the period he spends there between 1912 and 1924. And it could be that at that point he knew what he was writing and the world he was trying to create, and to a very real degree, all of the stories really do interlock. Right? They're all vignettes of a kind of unified world, so that sometimes you'll have one character that, someone who's the main character of one story will make a cameo appearance in another to show that these are all interlocking stories. And it could be that that's what he was trying to do. That's what he saw as his point, not to kind of document current affairs, but to create a portrait of a world that was already no longer existent. And that idea is here reflected here at the end of the essay, where Amichai says, during the recent municipal election campaigns in Israel and elections for the mayor of Jerusalem, Agnon abandoned his tradition of political neutrality to publish an appeal on behalf of the incumbent mayor of Jerusalem, Mordechai Ish Shalom, in which he went to the length of calling the latter God's choice for mayor of the holy city. Right? Now that's Agnonian irony, or that's Agnonian grandiosity, right? Then Amichai feels compelled to point out that Ish Shalom himself was not an observant Jew. When asked why he did this, Agnon replied that Ish Shalom was a quiet, unambitious man, and that Jerusalem would be better governed by an unassuming person like him, who would introduce no sweeping changes. who would then by his opponent, Teddy Kollek, the present mayor, a man with a reputation as an aggressive innovator who knows how to get things done. Now, of course, Teddy Kollek went on to become known as the greatest builder of Jerusalem since Herod. But Agnon had this kind of very conservative, with a lowercase c, the idea that things are as they should be attitude, and that's part of what's special about Jerusalem. When Talpiot, when the neighborhood got built up and more people started moving out here, part of the reason Agnon was attracted to Talpiot was it was a quiet suburb. He could sit and write undisturbed. Right? If you see pictures, if you see that photograph over there, you could see it was all open fields around this house. Right? This photograph here is taken exactly where it's placed, exactly where the photograph was taken. Right? There were no buildings. Agnon describes how from the top of the house you could look north and see all the way to the Temple Mount, and you could look east and see all the way to the Dead Sea. You can't do that anymore because all of these buildings have been built obstructing the view. So when suddenly, all of a sudden, there's this traffic coming along, disturbing his quiet, he gets Ish Shalom, Mordechai Shalom, to put up there was a sign. The sign doesn't exist anymore, but there are photographs of it. Sheket, Sofer Ba'avodah, quiet, author at work. Right? The traffic shouldn't disturb him. I'm sorry? What time was it? When was this written? This essay was written by Amichai in 1960. 66. The election was in 66. Yeah, Teddy Kollek became the mayor in 66. Right. Agnon haya kfar kimat ben 80, 79. Okay. Now Agnon, of course, very famously said there in front of the king of Sweden, I was born in one of the cities of the diaspora. Aval b'chol tamid domeh hayiti alai kemi shenolad b'Yerushalayim. I always imagined myself, I always regarded myself as one who was born in Jerusalem. Part of this mythic biography that we talked about last week when we talked about Lag BaOmer, part of the mythic biography that he crafts for himself is this idea that he was born in Jerusalem, that he in his soul is a Jerusalemite, although of course while he's here in Jerusalem, he has 2 feet back in Buchach. He leaves Buchach, he's 19 years old, and except for, one and a bit little visits, he never returns there. Right? He's to Buchach. He was there for a couple of days when his father died to sit Shiva. He didn't get there in time for the funeral. He was in Germany at the time. He gets a telegram, he goes. And then in the 30s, in 1930, he was there for about a 5-day visit, a 6-day visit or something like that. And that's the only time he's ever back there. But he never leaves. He's the example. You can take the boy out of Buchach, but you can't take the Buchach out of the boy. Like many great authors who kind of occupy a certain place, like Philip Roth and Newark, New Jersey, like Mark Twain and Hannibal, Missouri, like Faulkner and whatever that place is, Yokneam County in Mississippi. They occupy this place and they can never remove it from their soul. So for Agnon, it's this kind of double movement. He's born in Jerusalem, even though we know on his birth certificate it says Buchach. And when he's in Jerusalem, he's still mentally somehow in Buchach. It is something common to the immigrant experience. Yeah. In Shmol Shilshom, there's these lovely descriptions of Jerusalem. This is Jerusalem of the years before the First World War. And all of his physical descriptions, all of his geographical descriptions, both here and elsewhere, he was very precise. He didn't fudge the details. Right? And if he tells you it's this minute walk from this point to that point, you can bet that he walked and he timed it. But listen to the beauty of this description. In this way, Agnon's prose is sometimes more poetic than Amichai's poetry. A covenant is made with every city that stamps its seal on its inhabitants. Brit kruta l'chol ir, shetovat et chotma al yoshveha. Especially the city of God, most exquisite of all cities, where the divine presence never moves away from it. And even if the divine presence is hidden and covered, there are times and seasons when even the most simple son of Israel, who is blessed to dwell in Jerusalem, will sense it. Each to the degree of his sensibilities. Oh, hold on a second, I'm sorry. Each to the degree of his sensibilities and to his merit and to the light of grace that illuminates his soul, and by virtue of the suffering he has suffered in the land, and that he accepted with love and did not complain. Yitzchak Kumar, the young man who comes in Aliyah from Galicia, from Shibush, which is Buchach, who's not meant to be Agnon. We're not meant to believe that this Yitzchak is a projection of Agnon himself, but all of the biographical details, leaving Buchach, coming by boat, landing at Yafo, living in Yafo, moving from Yafo to Yerushalayim, these all line up with the dates and times and places of Agnon's own biography. Isaac looked before him and his heart began pounding. This is a description of him going into the old city of Jerusalem for the first time. As a man's heart pounds when he approaches the place of his desire. Now, I presume that all of you have some memory of the first time you came to Yerushalayim, the first time you went to the old city. I don't know about you, I was already an adult, a young adult. I didn't come to Israel for a visit until I was a sophomore in college, right? As opposed to my wife, who was already coming on visits from before she has solid memories. So I have a very solid memory of arriving and going to the old city and going to the hotel, and it was night and it was rainy. It was like one of those rainy, cold, kind of like tonight, cold Jerusalem, where everything is shiny and slick. Right, and that image of like first seeing the kotel when you're coming down the stairs from the Jerusalem from the Jewish quarter is very much imprinted on me. So Isaac looked before him, and his heart began pounding, as a man's heart pounds when he approaches the place of his desire. And because he was somewhat consoled by the voice of the old man sitting and singing melodies of prayer, he removed the gloom from his heart. Before him, the wall of Jerusalem suddenly appeared. This is the wall, not the kotel. This is the choma. This is the surrounding wall. He has yet to enter the old city. Woven into a red fire, plated with gold, surrounded by gray clouds, blended with blue clouds, which incise and engrave it with shapes of spun gold, choice silver, burnished brass, and purple tint. Yerushalayim shel zahav v'shel nechoshet v'shel or. Right? This is published in 1945. It's written earlier. Isaac rose up and wanted to say something. Right? He's so moved by this sight, this poetic description of what it looks like to look at the colors, how the color. I mean, this is what Naomi Shemer is working off of, the way the colors, right? She's writing this song. It's songs written in 65, 66, something like that, right? And here we are in the divided city, and we are in West Jerusalem, and we're looking out over the border. We can still see, and people used to come to this neighborhood to go to, where the Tayelet is now, in Armona Netziv, right? Because from there you could get a view of the old city. You could get a view of Har HaBayit. You could see the Temple Mount. You could see the Dome of the Rock. You could see the gold dome. And the way the light plays off of the walls, it's magical. And that's the description here. Spun gold, choice silver, burnished brass, purple tin. Isaac rose up and he wants to say something. Right? He's so moved by the beauty of the sight. But Isaac is a simple fellow, right? Remember, he said he's sometimes even a simple fellow, right? In the previous paragraph, we had said there are times and seasons when even the most simple son of Israel, who was blessed to dwell in Jerusalem, will sense the magic. And he's that person. And he can feel it. He can even the simplest Jew can appreciate this. But what can't he do? He can't be its poet. He can't write Yerushalayim Shel Zahav. In other words, this description of what Yitzchak saw and was moved by, those are the narrator's words. They aren't Yitzchak's words. Yitzchak can see it. He can feel it. He cannot describe it. He wanted to say something, but his tongue was hushed in his mouth, as in a mute song. D'mama l'shano b'fiv ki mitoch zemer eleh. He sat down as if carried away by a sitting dance. What's a sitting dance? Right, like Hasidim, they would dance. They would you ever go to the Kotel on Friday night and see those usually yeshiva boys come and they dance and they sing, right? So what's a sitting dance? Sitting dance is like a mute song. Like how do you dance and stand still, right? It's like being chained. And that's Yitzchak's experience. And that may have been the experience of many Jews throughout history. But they felt it. And it's one thing not to be the poet of Jerusalem. Not everybody can be the poet of Jerusalem. But everybody can feel that. He wanted, Isaac rose up, he wanted to say something, but his tongue was hushed in his mouth as in a mute song. He was unable to. He was either overwhelmed or incapable. He's not a very grandiloquent person. Now compare this to some of Amichai's poems. Now again, this is the poetry, the metaphors of the everyday. Here, look in Hebrew, then we'll look at the translation. Yerushalayim, Ir Namel al Sfat HaNetzach. Har Habayit Aniya Gdola. Sfinat Sha'ashuim Mifoeret. Me'eshnabei Katla Hama'aravi Mistaklim Kedoshim Alizim Nosim. Jerusalem is a port city on the shore of eternity. The Temple Mount is a huge ship, a magnificent luxury liner. From the portholes of her western wall, cheerful saints look out, travelers. Hasidim on the pier wave goodbye, shout, hooray, hooray, bon voyage. She's always arriving, always sailing away. And the fences and the piers and the policemen and the flags and the high masts of churches and mosques and the smokestacks of synagogues and the boats of psalms of praise and the mountain waves. The shofar blows. Another one has just left. Yom Kippur sailors in white uniforms climb along ladders and ropes of well-tested prayers. The metaphor of Jerusalem as Jerusalem is a port. And where do you set sail from Jerusalem? Eternity. And what's the ship? The ship itself is the Temple Mount. And the kind of gunnels of the ship, the sides of the ship, that's the wall, the western wall. And you can imagine people up there, like when the cruise ships set off and they're popping champagne and confetti and whatever else it is. That's what it is. Jerusalem is this kind of transport, a ferry between this world and eternity. Right? So it's a very Amichai's found a way around Yitzchak Kummer's problem. Yitzchak Kummer sees the beauty, the gold and the silver and the nechoshet and the light and he's overcome because people are overcome by the grandeur of Jerusalem. And Amichai finds a way to solve the problem of the mute song, of the sitting dance, by choosing everyday metaphors to describe the magic and beauty of Jerusalem. Because that's the condition of modernity. The grandiose is lost on us. To describe everything in exalted terms, to speak the language of the Psalms, might not be our current lexicon. But we know about what it means to send a telegram from here to there, what it means to be a passenger on a train, or for a ship to set sail. Now, the idea of ship setting sail is something that Agnon too writes about. It's called, and it starts. This is a poem. I'll put up online all of the sources. Most of these poems come from a volume, his last volume, called Patuach Sagur Patuach, Open Closed Open, which you can buy as a standalone volume, both in Hebrew and in English translation. Although I'm not sure if the English translation is a complete translation or it's just partial, but it's very well represented in the Alter volume. Agnon also describes ship travel, but for Agnon, ship travel is no mere metaphor. It was the actual mode of transportation between the bitter diaspora and those coming on Aliyah. Agnon himself came by boat, but he describes in one of his most beloved stories, Bilvav Yamim, in the heart of the seas, he describes a voyage of a group of Olim setting out in the beginning of the 19th century. The story is set 100 years before it's written. It's a group of 10 men and a bunch of women, some of the wives, daughters, etc., and a certain fellow named Hanania, who's a kind of mystical character who's in their midst. And they set sail by sea. Hanania, who had kind of gone through all these wanderings, he's a kind of description of the wandering Jew. This Hanania, this mystical, magical fellow who, according to one interpretation of the story, is a kind of stand-in for Chaim Nachman Bialik, who was Agnon's. He was a bit older than Agnon, but he was a friend of Agnon. They had a complicated relationship, but they were mutual admirers. Bialik, the great poet. And in the heart of the seas, although set in the 1830s, is really saying more about the 1930s. About the time of modern political Zionism. And it's a kind of cautionary tale that in the attempt to build a modern state, or to build a proto-state, to build a society that could become its own independent state, we can't forget the magic. We can't forget the wonder. We can't forget the dreams that kind of fueled the Jewish longing for Eretz Yisrael for 2,000 years. It's all about building roads and bridges and tunnels and etc. We'll do so at great peril. Because what will fuel the Jewish engagement is and always will be the ongoing magic of the land of Israel. And that was a kind of magic that kept us going for a long time. Before Herzl made Zionism an actual practical plan. Of course, there were Jews, very few in number, who did come on Aliyah throughout history, including the description of these characters in the beginning of the 19th century. In reality, that was the significant exception and not the rule. But what all those Jews in the diaspora had was the longing for Eretz Yisrael. But what were they longing for? What did they know about Eretz Yisrael? I mean, it's not like today, right? You've all come on Aliyah. You're Israeli, or you're right? So we've all come on Aliyah, and the folks online, well, they'll come soon, right? Everyone laughed. But did anybody come on Aliyah without having been here before? Without ever having visited once? Visiting dozens of times? Right? So we all knew when we dreamed about Eretz Yisrael sitting in Long Island or wherever it is that we came from, like we knew what we were talking about. So when you dream about something that you know about in reality, it's a different kind of dream. So Hanania says that he'd been wandering around. He'd been hoping, he'd been desiring to go off to Eretz Yisrael. By that time, I myself was beginning to doubt whether the land of Israel actually existed. So I decided I had better leave them to themselves, the people he was with, and went away. Better, said I to myself, that I should perish on the way and not lose my faith, the land of Israel. He doesn't even know, like, is Eretz Yisrael, is it just like a myth? Is it kind of like a utopia, a no-man land, a never-never land that exists only in our imagination? He says, God forbid I should lose my faith in the reality So I better set off, and that's why I have now set off to go on this journey to the land of Israel. And the group is sitting around, and they're all talking in this manner. One of the people in the group is a character who the author has named Shmuel Yosef Halevi ben Shalom, Shmuel Yosef ben Shalom Mordechai Halevi, which is, of course, none other than Agnon's own name. And this Shmuel Yosef ben Shalom Mordechai Halevi was a Mesaper Agadot Eretz Yisrael, Mesaper Sipurei Eretz Yisrael. And along the journey, he's sitting next to his wife, whose name is Esther, which happens, of course, been Agnon's wife's own name. He's kind of like cut and pasted himself out of time and retrograded himself in a story that's set 100 years earlier. And his job is to be the person that tells the tales, the stories, the wonder tales of Eretz Yisrael, which give the people hope to keep going on in their journey. There are these two women. Let's assume that they're simple women, the kind of stereotype of old. At that very moment, one of the women was saying to another, I don't know what has come over me. Here they are at sea, rolling along. For first, I think that I've never seen such a lovely night. And then it seems to me, on the contrary, I have already seen such a night, and the very things I hear now I have heard before. I know that is not so, yet I cannot be certain it is not so. She's kind of having what do we call that? A déjà vu. To which her companion replied, perhaps we have already journeyed once before to the land of Israel, and everything we have heard and seen here, we heard and saw before on some other night. In that case, said the first, why are we here and not already in the land of Israel? And they're headed to Eretz Yisrael, and she's having this déjà vu. I feel I've already been on this journey. So her friend says, well, maybe we've already journeyed to the land of Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel. So if we've already gone there, then what the heck are we doing here outside? My friend, said the other, we have already been there. If we've already been there, said the first, how is that we're here? My friend, said the other, ere you go asking how we came to be here, I shall ask you how we came to be exiled from the land of Israel, and how we came to be scattered among the nations. So you understand, they're talking about themselves, but they're talking about themselves as representative of the whole Jewish people. In that way, the Agadah in Masechet Nida, that everybody learns Torah in the womb. And when you come out into the world, when you're born, the angel comes and smacks you on the lip. That's why we have this little indentation here, and causes you to forget all the Torah. So that all the Torah that you study throughout your life is not really learning as it is relearning, as it is regaining that which was lost. So the journey to Eretz Yisrael is akin to that. We're going to Eretz. Now, of course, these two women not only had they never been to Eretz Yisrael before, they'd probably never been more than 20 miles away from the little town that they were born and raised in and spent their whole lives in. So what does it mean they've been to Eretz Yisrael? Like today, like people get on the plane and they travel back and forth 4 times a year. No! But we've been to Eretz Yisrael before. Why? Because we're part of the Jewish people. And the Jewish people have been to Eretz Yisrael before, and somehow it's in the collective conscience. So you ask me, how is it that we're going to Eretz Yisrael? That's not the question. The question is, how did we get kicked out in the first place? So it doesn't really matter how it is that we're getting back, right? We just have to make sure to be vigilant against being exiled. Are you able to withstand the cold a drop more? Yeah. Right. The same. This is a kind of like a meme, as people say in the midrashic imagination, that we were all at Har Sinai, that we were all learned the Torah, that we were all in Eretz Yisrael. This idea that kind of there's certain pivotal events and places and times in Jewish history where we all have a connection to, even though we know in reality, historically it's not true, but as part of the midrashic imagination, it's true. In Tehillah, I mentioned Tehillah earlier, Agnon's tale of this very righteous woman, Tehillah, this long-suffering and righteous woman, Tehillah. The narrator, who here again we're presumed to believe the narrator is a projection of Agnon, and again all of the dates do line up. The narrator is a man who'd been living in Eretz Yisrael but had gone abroad, and because of events that happened there, his house burns down, etc. He returns to live in Jerusalem in the fall of 1924. And he's living at that time in Nachalat Shiva, in the center of town, what we call today Merkaz Ha'ir. And he makes his living as an author. Long story short, if you don't remember Tehillah, you really owe it to yourself to read it. Long story short, he goes to the old city on an errand. And while he's doing that errand, he encounters this woman, Tehillah, who we discover in the course of the story is 104 years old. And he discovers through his involvement with her that she's a profoundly righteous woman. There are a few characters that Agnon portrays with as much dignity. There are a few characters that Agnon portrays with no satirical critique. Tehillah is one of these truly noble figures. But he also discovers the suffering and pain and tragedy that has marked her long life. At a certain point, midway through the story, he is unable to get back to the city, so he hasn't been back to the old city, so he hasn't been there for a while. At one point, Tehillah says to him, "It's too bad you don't live in the city." So he says, "What are you talking about? Of course I live in the city. Isn't Nachalat Shiva? Nachalat Shiva is, where Rehov Hillel is, where Rehov Shammai is. That's where Agnon first lived in 1924 before he moved out here to Talpiot. So he says, isn't Nachalat Shiva, isn't that neighborhood, isn't that also part of Jerusalem?" So she says, "Oh, yes, of course it is. But those of us that live lifnim min hachoma, inside the walls of the old city, and we discover that she's been there since before the settlement outside the walls of the old city." Right? She had arrived, if you do the math in the story, you can figure out she'd been living, the story takes place in 1924, she'd been living in Yerushalayim since the 1860s prior to the establishment of any settlement outside of the walls. So those of us that remember Yerushalayim, lifnim min hachoma, those of us that remember Yerushalayim when Yerushalayim was just inside the walls of the city, we have a hard time imagining what goes on the outside. Now, this story, Tehillah, is written in 1952. It's set in 1924. And again, the same idea. Let me just reemphasize this. Usually a story is saying more about the time in which it's written than the time in which it's set. Bilvav Yamim, in the Heart of the Seas, is written in the 1930s, but it's set in the 1830s. But really, it's a cautionary tale to the Zionism, the modern Zionism of the 1930s. Tehillah is this description of life inside the walls of the old city, but it's written in 1952. It's written just a few years after, I'm sorry, I think I'm mistaken, 1950, even, just 2 years after the fall of the old city, after the division of the city, after we can no longer go there, after a border has been established in between with barbed wire. And it's an what? Right. No, in other words, it's written in 1950, it's set in 1924, right? In other words, in the story, he's able to go to the old city because it's set in 1924. But it's written in 1950, and what is it? It's an elegy. It's a kinah for the old city. Excuse me. It's an elegy it's a lamentation for the old city, which is now closed off to us. And Tehillah herself might be an embodiment and a representation of the old city. After having been away, he comes back. He says, various preoccupations kept me for a while from going to the city. And after that came the nuisances of the tourists. Now, we still experience that. At least I do. I don't know about you, but we still experience this. How well we know these tourists who descend upon us and upon the land, all because the Holy One has made a little space for us here. They come now to see what has happened, and having come, they regard us as if we were created solely to serve them. the sights, we see them ourselves. I'm sorry, yet one good thing may be said for the tourists. In showing them the sights, we see them ourselves. You know, you have family or relatives that come to visit, you have to show them around. What? No, the narrator who's like we're imagining is Agnon himself. Once or twice, having brought them to the city to show them the western wall, I met Tilly, that's Tehillah. It seemed to me that a change had come over her. Although she had always walked without support, I noticed that she now leaned on a stick. On account of the visitors, I was unable to linger, for they had come to spy out the whole land. That's, of course, reminiscent of the Meraglim. For they had come out to spy out the whole land, not to spend time upon an old woman, not even mentioned in their itineraries. Now, really, what would be, if somebody were to come to Yerushalayim just once, what would be the most important thing for them to see? No. Tehillah. Could you imagine as a person like this in the world, wouldn't you want to meet her? Wouldn't you want to know her? Wouldn't you want to say, I spoke to her? Wouldn't you want to say, she gave me a bracha, she gave me a blessing? But they don't know. Why? Because they think you come, what is a tourist? A tourist has to see the Kotel, and you have to see Migdal David, and today you have to go to Malcha, the mall, and you have to go to, I don't know, the zoo and the train station, and you have to eat in these 10 different restaurants that all have the same menu, right? But really, you know what? There are people like Tehillah in the world. And what you should do, you should like come to Yerushalayim, you should say, you know what? Yerushalayim is full of tzaddikim. Of all stripes, right? There are Hasidic tzaddikim, and there are misnagdish Hasidim, and there are religious Hasidim, and there are secular Hasidim, and there are people that do things that are remarkable, right? So, like, you should say, I want to meet 10 of those people, and I'll live. I don't need to go see. This museum or that museum. But nobody thinks in those terms because you come on a tour and you have this itinerary, and on the itinerary it says you have to see the Kotel, but it doesn't say nobody knows about Tehillah. So he's being ironic here, right? He says these people, he's showing them around. These people come to visit him. He's showing them around, and he sees Tehillah, and he wants to be with Tehillah. He wants to spend time with her. He's been influenced by her, right? She's beginning to have an impact, a transformative impact on him, right? But he says, I don't have time to do that because I have to schlep them from here to there and they don't even realize that the most significant thing you could see is this little old lady, this 104-year-old woman sitting there with her cane because she's not on their itinerary. Now, Amichai has a poem. It's a prose poem. It's laid out like a block of prose. It's called Tayarim, Tourists. I don't know that he was engaging with this passage from Tehillah. I don't know that he was trying to dialogue with it, but you can see that he's dealing with the same theme. Here's the poem. Once I was sitting on the steps near the gate at David's citadel, Migdal David, and put down my 2 heavy baskets beside me. A group of tourists stood there around their guide, and I became their point of reference. You see that man over there with the baskets? A little to the right of his head, there's an arch from the Roman period. A little to the right of his head. But he's moving! He's moving! I said to myself, redemption will come only when they are told, do you see that arch over there from the Roman period? It doesn't matter. But near it, a little to the left, and then down a bit, there's a man who has just bought fruit and vegetables for his family. It's the same idea. It's the same theme, right? The significant thing in Jerusalem, you know, that's the thing. We're surrounded by all of this history, right? It's overwhelming. Like you walk in the old city, and in some places you're walking on stones. You know, as the Christians say, Jesus could have walked on these stones. For us, we'd say Rabbi Akiva might have walked on these. And it really might be. We're not just making that up. You know, like sometimes you go on these tours, and the tourists, the tour guides, they're just making things up left and right. But since they know more than everybody else, nobody knows the difference. But this is really true. we just like live embedded with history. The same way he described, we live with all this kind of holiness around us, which is sometimes suffocating. We live with this history around us, and it's suffocating. And because there's so much to see and pay attention to, sometimes we, miss the forest for the trees, or we miss the tzaddikim for the Roman arches. And here, his redemption will come when people will pay attention to the simple fellow that went to the shuk to buy fruits and vegetables for his family. For many years, I misremembered the poem, and I somehow remembered it as saying, "There's a man who has just bought fruit and vegetables for Shabbat." But that says more about the way I remember things than the poem that Amichai wrote. But either way, the sentiment is the same. But you see how Amichai and Agnon are playing off the same theme. Later in Tmol Shel Shom, when Yitzchak has moved from Yafo to Yerushalayim and is this figure who's very much torn. Yitzchak is very much torn. The choice of his name, Yitzchak, does not bode well. What association do you have? Akedat Yitzchak, but unlike Akedat Yitzchak, the fact that he's tied down to the altar and nearly slaughtered, but for Arya, without a spoiler alert, Arya Yitzchak, there's no angel that comes at the end and says, Al tishlach yadcha lanar. Arya Yitzchak meets a bad end. And quite literally tied down to his bed, suffering from the bite of a rabid dog. Yes, exactly. But Yitzchak is torn. He's torn between everything. He's torn between Shibush, Buchach, the old world, and Eretz Yisrael. In Eretz Yisrael, he's torn between secular, modern Yafo and the old Yishuv of Jerusalem. And even in Jerusalem, he's torn between two types of Jerusalem. The Lord of Dreams came to Isaac and pulled him to the sea. There he forgot his shoes. He's having a dream, and in his dream he sees the ocean, and he forgets his shoes. He went back to his shoes, and the wind flew his hat off. If you read Tmol Shel Shom, unfortunately, look, if you can read in Hebrew, you should read in Hebrew. Unfortunately, the translation of Tmol Shel Shom is extremely problematic. But, when you read Tmol Shel Shom, be attentive to the symbols of hats and shoes. They're on every page. What are hats and what are shoes? I mean, hats are sometimes, religious garb. And sometimes hats are just hats. But hats are above, up to the heaven. And shoes are on the ground. They're your connection to the earth. And here's Yitzchak. He's lost his hat, he's lost his shoes. A man encountered him and said, "Come and I'll show you where your hat is." When he went with him, the man disappeared. Isaac stood in the street barefoot, without shoes, his head bare. Right? So he's neither connected above nor below. He's caught betwixt and between. What's above and below? Well, heaven and earth, but also we have this notion of Yerushalayim shel Mala and Yerushalayim shel Mata. A midrashic idea that there's the Jerusalem, terrestrial Jerusalem, the real world Jerusalem that we are now occupying. Where sometimes it gets cold at night, even though it's the end of May. And there's celestial Jerusalem, the Platonic Jerusalem, the ideal Jerusalem, where there's never traffic jams and where there's never terror attacks and where everybody behaves as they should. So this idea of the ideal and the real, the celestial Jerusalem, the heavenly Jerusalem, and the real world, earthly, terrestrial Jerusalem. He heard the sound of prayer and followed the sound. He came to a 2-story house, right? Above and below. The bottom story in ruins, and you climb a ladder to the top story where they were praying. And a ladder stood straight. What is this reminding you of? Sulam Yaakov, right? Jacob's ladder, ascending up to heaven.
He leaned the ladder and ascended. When he put his head in, the door closed on him from inside, and his body was outside. That's how it was one night, and 2 nights, and 3 nights. And he thought he would never get rid of his bad dream. There's a dream. He's caught. He's like looking in. He's half inside. He's hanging. His head is inside. His bottom half is hanging out the window on the 2nd floor. And he's trapped, literally trapped between heaven and earth. Right? He's a figure who isn't home, neither here nor there. He's trapped between Chutz La'aretz and Eretz Yisrael. He's trapped between the secular modern and the old world tradition. He's trapped between the real of Jerusalem and the ideal of Jerusalem. And he can't resolve these tensions. And these ideas of the tensions between Jerusalem of above and Jerusalem below, Shel Mala and Shel Mata, is a theme that occupied him in many places. He has a long story called Lifnim Min HaChoma, which was only published posthumously from manuscript in 1975. The title story, Lifnim Min HaChoma, Inside the Walls. This is a story that was presumably written in the 60s, the same period when it's impossible to go Lifnim Min HaChoma, when it's impossible to go into the old city. But in the story, the narrator goes for this long, extended walk around Yerushalayim with a young female character who has been interpreted alternatively as the embodiment of the Shekhinah, of the divine, or a kind of externalization of his own soul. And they go walking through the old city of Jerusalem, right? At a time when this would have been historically impossible, but it's a kind of agadah, it's a kind of dream even. I mean, the story itself is very surrealistic. And they go walking into the Jerusalem, but the Jerusalem that they're walking through is this kind of idealized Jerusalem. In a long cycle of poems called Yerushalayim, Yerushalayim, Lama Yerushalayim, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, why Jerusalem, Amichai is dealing with these themes. He says a city that has a wall, as Jerusalem has, is like children who have a father. Right? The idea of an embracing, protective wall. Elama, neither wall nor father can protect them any longer. That idea that father surrounds you, protects you, embraces you is an idea that works in your childhood. But everybody has to grow up sometime. And even that idea of the wall protecting Jerusalem, we know what happened historically to that wall in Jerusalem. Many times it was breached. And then the poem goes on. I'm skipping through parts of it. You see these numbers at the top of each poem. In other words, he would write these, Amichai would write these long poem cycles. Each numbered paragraph or each numbered poem in a way can stand on its own, but they all hang together. And I understand that they were written sometimes over many different years and then kind of gathered together. So it's not the kind of thing where you have to read the poem all together. These are kind of smaller poems that fit like a puzzle into a piece, but each numbered section, as it were, can stand on its own, but presumably it's better to read the whole thing beginning to end. But I'm skipping through in this larger cycle of Yerushalayim, Yerushalayim, Lama Yerushalayim. Jerusalem is like an Atlantis, and he keeps doing these kinds of similes. Jerusalem is like this, it's like that. Why Jerusalem and why not that? Jerusalem is like Atlantis that sank into the sea. Everything there is submerged and sunken. This is not the heavenly Jerusalem, but the one down below. So he has this idea that, in other words, there's Yerushalayim Shel Mala above and Yerushalayim Shel Mata. But maybe there's also a Yerushalayim that's in the basement. In other words, we know about this Jerusalem. So maybe this Jerusalem is, right, and this is all relative, right? Is Yerushalayim Shel Mata is here, and Yerushalayim Shel Mala is above it, right? Or maybe Yerushalayim Shel Mala is, what's the base? What's the baseline? Is it that Yerushalayim, our Jerusalem, the Jerusalem we lived in, is the baseline, and there's an even better one? Or maybe it's that Yerushalayim Shel Mala is the baseline, and we're sunk in the Yerushalayim Shel Mata. Yerushalayim is like Atlantis, it's a sunken city. It's not the heavenly Jerusalem, but the one down below, way down below. And from the sea floor, they dredge up ruined walls and fragments of faiths, like rust-covered vessels from sunken prophecy ships. That's not rust. It's blood that has never dried. So there's also sometimes a bleakness to it, a recognition of how imperfect, how short of the ideal our Jerusalem is. Jerusalem is a merry-go-round and round. From the old city through all the neighborhoods and back to the old. Right? In other words, this idea of, right, there's the old city and there's the new city, and they're in dichotomy. Just like Yitzchak Kumar is torn between different parts of Jerusalem. Right? Not just above and below, but even within Jerusalem. You go around and around. And you can't get off the merry-go-round. Whoever jumps off puts his life on the line. And whoever gets off at the final round has to pay again and get back on for the rounds that have no end. And instead of elephants and painted horses to ride, like you have on a merry-go-round, there are religions that go up and down and turn on their axis to the music of oily tunes from the houses of prayer. Jerusalem is a seesaw. In other words, one, you have this idea of the merry-go-round, you're going around and around and around, right? Sometimes you're in the old city, sometimes you're in the new city. You go back and forth and back and forth. You can never get off, right? And sometimes, like, you know, you're on the horse on the merry-go-round, you're going up and down, right? So sometimes your religion is up and sometimes your religion is down. Sometimes the Mamluks are in charge, sometimes the Ottomans, sometimes the Christians, and then even sometimes the Jews. But Jerusalem is also like a seesaw. Sometimes I dip down into the past generations, sometimes I rise up to the skies. And then I shriek like a child, feet swinging on high. I want down, Daddy. I want down. Abba, get me down. And that's how the saints all ascend to heaven, like a child screaming, Abba, I want to stay up here. Abba, don't get me down. Avinu Malkeinu, leave us up here. Avinu Malkeinu. So Yerushalayim has that potential as well. But the division, the tension, the duality of Jerusalem, the division of Jerusalem is represented most famously in this poem, which is really hard to translate. It's challenging to translate because it's playing off certain features of Hebrew, which can't be translated into English. So I'll read it in Hebrew, then I'll read and explain the translation. Lama Yerushalayim Tamid Shtayim. You understand that in Hebrew you have this plural ending. Yerushalayim is technically a plural. Like in English, the way the word pants. Pants describes this one piece of clothing that I'm wearing, but it's plural. Like glasses. I mean, even though there are two lenses, which may be why it's plural, right? But it's one item, glasses. We don't say I'm wearing my glass. I'm wearing my glasses. My pants, probably built in plural because it's two legs. So Yerushalayim is like Michnasayim, Mishkafayim, right? In Hebrew, the ayim at the end indicates a plural. Yomayim, 2 days. Lama Yerushalayim Tamid Shtayim, Shel Mala v'Shel Mata, v'ani rotze lechyot b'Yerushalayim Shel Emtza. Why is there always two Jerusalems? The Jerusalem above and the Jerusalem below. Why can't I live in the Jerusalem in the middle, in the balance? If Jerusalem is a seesaw in the earlier stanza, right? Why can't it be a seesaw that's found some balance? Ani rotze lechyot rak b'Yerushal achat, ki ani rak ani echad velo aniyayim. And the word plays in the Hebrew. If you understand the Hebrew, you're lucky. But the translation goes like this. Why is Jerusalem, Yerushalayim, always two, meaning always plural? The heavenly and the earthly. I want to live in between Jerusalem, the Jerusalem of the middle. without banging my head up above or gnashing my feet down below? And why is Yerushalayim in the dual form, like hands, yadayim, and feet, raglayim? I want to live in Jerusalem, singular, because I am just I, singular, and not in Ayim. Right? They've been creative, right? But I am singular, and I want only one Jerusalem. I don't want to be caught between different Jerusalems. Why Jerusalem? Why not the sublime San Francisco? After all, she already bears the name of that bird-loving saint, and she has a golden gate, ascents and descents and ascents, right? San Francisco, like on paper, has all the things you need to be a Jerusalem: gold and saints and up and down, and a rumbling in the depths always ready to burst forth in fire and pillars of smoke, as when God gave the Torah on Mount Sinai, and an earth that opens its mouth wide, as in the Bible. Right? They also have earthquakes in San Francisco. Right? It's almost a biblical town, but it's not. And this idea plays throughout the poem. Why not San Francisco? Why not Paris? Why not New York? Why Jerusalem? Did I skip something? Why Jerusalem? Why me? Why not another city, another person? Once I stood at the western wall, when suddenly a flock of startled birds soared up, shrieking and flapping their wings like bits of paper, with wishes scribbled on them, wishes that flew out from between the massive stones and ascended on high. He's back to that idea of the holiness, the atmosphere taking on this kind of physical form, the prayers themselves like birds ascending. That you don't have in San Francisco or Paris or New York. The ecology of Jerusalem, the feeling, right? That's unique to Jerusalem. Notice he comes back in my reading of the poem, right? He comes back to this idea there's something inherent about Jerusalem. We could not cut and paste San Francisco or Paris or London or Madrid or New York and replace Jerusalem with them. There's something inherent built into the earth of Jerusalem, the air of Jerusalem. Wait, now where did I lost? Oh, here we are. Wait, I just have 2 pages out of order here. Longing for Jerusalem, for childhood in Jerusalem, in another faraway time. The child, he's remembering his childhood. He comes to Yerushalayim shortly before Bar Mitzvah, and he's remembering his childhood in Yerushalayim. The same way that Agnon remembers his childhood in Jerusalem, even though it's a fictitious one. But which children is he remembering? He's remembering the children of the Levi'im, the Levites, longing, now that they are old and exiled by the waters of Babylon. Al Naharot Bavel, Psalms 137, the song of how the Levites are carried away in exile to Babylonia, and they're told, Shiru lanu shir mishir Tzion, give us a song. The Babylonians tempt them, they torture them. They say, you Levites, what was your job? You were the temple choristers. You were the ones that sang the songs, the psalms in the Holy Temple. Why don't you sing for us now that you're in exile by these waters of Babylon? Right? Al Narod Bavel. And they can't sing. And they're tormented and tortured by this. They still remember singing in the temple when their voices had just begun to change. At night, they remind one another of their childhood. Remember how we played hide and seek behind the Holy of Holies, among the urns of frankincense, near those drainage ditches around the altar, in the shadow of the embroidered mantle of the Holy Ark, between the Chruvim, the cherubs. Right? They're remembering, they're nostalgic for their childhood. What's the Jewish memory of the childhood, of the pure, of the simple, of the old, not of their actual childhood, not of our actual childhood, because it's not in our actual memory, but in the collective Jewish memory. It's when we lived in Eretz Yisrael, when there was the Holy Temple. Now, this idea of the Levi'im singing was taken up by Agnon again in Stockholm. After he tells the king of Sweden and all the assembled, I was like one born in Jerusalem. He says, in a dream, in a vision of the night, I saw myself. Agnon himself was a Levi. And he was always very proud to tell you that he was a Levite. He says, I saw myself in a dream standing with the other Levim, my brother Levim, in the holy temple, singing the songs of David Melech Yisrael. What was my job? In other words, out of the historic catastrophe that Titus of Rome came and destroyed Jerusalem and banished the Jewish people and took me out to the exile, or as Elie Wiesel retold Agnon's description here, it was as if his cradle was kidnapped from Jerusalem and stolen off into the exile. But if it weren't for that historical catastrophe of 2,000 years ago, I would have been born in Eretz Yisrael, and I would have been a Levite, and I would have sung the songs of David Melech Yisrael in the Holy Temple, even though Agnon did not have a great singing voice. Okay, we'll leave that aside. And what happened? I heard the songs that I would have sung. And if I would have sung them when I was awake, the Jewish people would have died of heartbreak to hear the beauty that had been taken away from them. To console me for having prevented me from singing with my mouth, they enable me to compose songs in writing. How do I describe what I've done in modern Hebrew literature? It's a compensation for the destruction of Jerusalem. No more, no less. It's a consolation for the loss of the holy service in the temple. That now I am able to write in prose what I formerly would have sung in praise. And the return to Israel and modern Zionism and becoming a modern Hebrew author is a consolation for all of the tragedies of the last 2,000 years of Jewish history. Because it's not enough that we came back and built ourselves a country. It's not enough that the survivors literally walked out of Auschwitz and came and fought a war and made a state of Israel. And then 19 years later reunited Jerusalem with itself. It's not just about the bricks and mortar. It's about the atmosphere. Sometimes that atmosphere is stifling. Sometimes there's so much holy smog that you can't breathe. But part of the Jewish return to the land of Israel is the reawakening of an authentic Jewish, Hebrew, Jewish culture. And Agnon says, assembled members of the Swedish Academy who recognized my achievement, and who knows what those judges of the Swedish Academy really understood about Agnon. But that's what you're awarding. The revival of the Jewish spirit in the land of Israel, in the Jewish language. That is his greatest accomplishment. And that is the accomplishment for which he was awarded. Now, whether in Sweden they understood that the award was a consolation for 2,000 years of exile or not, I'm not sure. But that's what he was trying to tell them about being a Levite. And he reminds them between the lines of Psalms 137, Al Naharot Bavel, where the Levites go out and they're commanded to sing, they're taunted. And what's the new Jewish song that we're going to sing? It's going to be the new state of Israel. It's going to be in 6 months after this, the reunification of Jerusalem. It's going to be the flowering of a revived Jewish civilization and culture and language and prose and poetry in a way that was unimaginable to the Jews all those years in the exile, except in a dream. And now the dream has become a reality in Yerushalayim, and this, I think, is something of, in each in their own way, but somehow interlocking, somehow touching on each other, each in their own way, these are some of the themes that Agnon and Amichai were playing off of in their work. We've just done a drop in the sea, of course, and there's so much more. But I commend to you to read Amichai, who again, if you can't read in Hebrew, if you could read Hebrew, the Hebrew is really, it's much easier. Somebody who's a competent but not native Hebrew speaker, it's much easier to read Amichai in Hebrew than it is to read Agnon in Hebrew. But to read him either in Hebrew or in translation, and of course, to always pay attention to the depth and the magic of Agnon's own writing. Next week we'll conclude our series on a much warmer night. I'm sure it'll be very toasty next week. You'll be complaining about how hot it is, but we'll look at his debut Hebrew story, the signature story, Agunot. It's a short story. It's about 12 or 13 pages. I will email it to you. Oh, so you already have it, but Yofi. So it's also in there. And those of you online can get it from the website, or you'll be getting it by email. And we will conclude our conversation next week with Agunot. Yes, questions? Yeah. The English? The Hebrew you can get in the 5-volume collection. You can get in Stamatsky, and if they don't have it in stock, they can order it. They will order it. But you can also buy individual volumes. You don't have to buy the whole 5-volume set. What? If you go into Stamatsky and ask them, they should be. I think, yeah. So okay, folks online, thanks for joining us, and Yom Yerushalayim Sameach to all. Okay.